We're continuing on with our series on the anxiety of a sacrifice, looking at comparing the anxiety that Abraham experienced when he was called to sacrifice his only son to that with Jesus leading up to the cross. And this week, we are specifically kind of doing part two of what I would consider kind of the background to really understanding that story. And that is focusing on when God actually fulfills this promise that he has made to both Abraham in this case and the world in the case of the coming of Jesus. And it's interesting to note here that Isaac's birth has takes place many years after the verses that we read last week, when God promised to make Abraham a new nation. Some of you might have even noticed when I read those verses that Abraham wasn't actually even called Abraham; he was called Abram. So, amongst the many things that have happened between that point and this birth of Isaac, is that Abraham's name has changed in Scripture. There's an entire process that he went through. He did a whole covenant with God, and that was where God actually changed his name and moved it to what we know him as, which is Abraham. Nobody ever really calls him Abram anymore. And all of that, more things even happened with this. Him and his wife, they traveled to Egypt. They, went through all these things, and they eventually got impatient because they were already somewhat old at the time that God came and told them made this promise to him. But they were now even further along in age. And so Abraham actually ended up taking, by Sarah's own, suggestion, ended up taking her handmaiden and having a kid with her. And this was a common practice back then. If you didn't have a male heir, you couldn't pass on your what you yourself had wealth wise. There's nobody to take care of your family. And so, at times you would take, a second wife, a concubine, whatever, to just kind of continue that bloodline on. I know nowadays we hear that practice and we look at it kind of with horror, but it was common back then when you had kind of that sort of idea of, inheritance passing on only through males and those sorts of things as kind of law. But through all of this, Abraham still had this hope that God was going to fulfill that promise. And God did. Angels did appear to him and his wife and told him, yes, this is now the time. She is going to have a kid. But even then, Sarah was doubtful of it. Even then, Sarah laughed at it. And she actually got reprimanded for it. But eventually, we get to this point, and you can see the joy that they themselves are expressing. They are so overjoyed to finally have a son. Sarah even says, God has brought me laughter. And that's what she's referring to here, that she's happy now that she has that son. And it's understandable. And I know we seem like we're kind of spreading this out when I said we're going to specifically focus on the anxiety of the sacrifice, but I think that these two parts are really important to understand, because you can't get what Abraham was really going through until you understand the promise that was made to him and the way he felt when he had that fulfillment of a promise. Similarly, when we're looking at Jesus's life himself, and the way that we ourselves react to him and the way that his own time period reacted to him, we can't understand him without also understanding the promise that God had made beforehand that he ended up fulfilling. And that is very, very, very important to understand in Scripture. And it's something that we do need to take time on. In Jesus's case, we see in the story of his birth that we read every year around the time of Christmas, we see that there is this celebration, this elevation of him as the Son of God, as that Messiah that has come to right the wrongs that have been made. And there was more to this as well. There was an entire expectation around that time that the Messiah was going to be there, that the Messiah was going to be born. Of course, the Messiah that was being thought of was purely a political one, purely one that was going to reestablish the Israel kingdom and turn it into either, a regional power or overthrow the Roman Empire entirely and become a world power in that sort of sense. And that's what the Jews were all looking for. They weren't looking for that kid in a manger in Bethlehem wrapped in cloths who was going to die for the sins of the world. That just never crossed them. And throughout Jesus' ministry, we see this is one of the big tensions, that he doesn't meet that expectation of what people were expecting. So when he's saying, I'm a fulfillment of this promise, it was hard for them to understand. It was hard for them to understand until after everything happened. Even then, there were still people who rejected it, as there are today. For Abraham and Sarah, the fulfillment of this promise brought them joy immediately. But in the case of Jesus' own coming, it hasn't been until years later, after his death and resurrection, that really that was fully understood by more than just his closest followers. And of course, today we celebrate it as a great joy every single year in December. With all of that, I want you all to keep that in mind. This next week, we are going to be finishing up on this, and we are going to be talking specifically about that story. But I want you to keep this joy in mind. I want you to keep this happiness in mind because it is a part of this story. It is a part of the crucifixion. It's part of the reason why, at the same similar to how we celebrate joy every single year at the time of Christmas, we also kind of go into a state of mourning when we recognize Jesus' death. So with all of that, I will leave you all with our last song today.